So I've played 4 hours of Assassin's Creed Shadows and I have some thoughts. Ubisoft invited me to a remote session so I could bring you guys the gameplay that you're about to see. And after spending some time with the story, with the combat and the exploration, I got a better sense of what Ubisoft is trying to do here. Generally speaking, I came out of it more impressed than I thought I would. So in the spirit of fairness, I'm going to go over the things that I liked, the things that were so and so for me, and the things that I thought could be better. And I want to jump straight into the combat, which I feel is one of the best aspects of Assassin's Creed Shadows. Definitely something that Ubisoft has nailed down this time around. It definitely seems like the extra month of development was put to good use. So combat in this game feels very impactful. It feels very weighty and has a good satisfying visual and audio feedback, to the point that I was constantly finding myself seeking the next fight because it was that addicting to me. Which is exactly what you want from a game where you spend most of the time fighting anyway. And I've got to disappoint some folks over here, but between the two protagonists, Yasuke was definitely my favorite. He's a complete powerhouse, his attacks have a lot of weight to them, and the battlefield quickly turns messy whenever you have him around. And especially his Naginata is really fun to play around with, as you're going to see from the weapon section of this video in just a little bit. Not to say that Naoe was any less fun, she's equally as enjoyable to play, but from a different perspective, a more shinobi stealth playstyle kind of perspective. So playing as her feels distinct from playing as Yasuke. Her moves are much quicker, she's nimble, her dodges are better, she has more flair in her moveset because she has all of these cool animations. She can also parry just as well as Yasuke, but there's this distinction between them that's oftentimes reflected both in the way they play, but also in the way they complete missions. So since Naoe is much better at stealth, when you choose to complete main story missions with her, your gameplay sections more often than not will include sneaking around bases, assassinating targets, and kind of playing the staple Assassin's Creed formula, but with a more of a shinobi twist. In contrast, choosing Yasuke instead typically puts him in the front lines, such as leading an assault on a castle, smashing through doors, and basically going through heaps of enemies at any given time. And I really loved this distinction both in playstyle and mission design, as it offers a great way to switch up the playstyle whenever it gets too stale with one character or the other. And switching between them is just as easy too. During main story missions, there are often multiple occasions to swap between the protagonists depending on the narrative, while in the open world, you can just pull it off right here from the main menu. It's a simple press of a button and you can do it at almost any given moment. Besides that, there were a few other combat aspects I really enjoyed. So you have your light and heavy attacks, but you can also hold down these buttons to perform their charged versions. And depending at what point in the attack chain you pull these off at, a different type of attack from a different angle will follow. So it really feels like the game lets you toy with your food a lot more than before, as you'll see from some of the sections coming up next, especially ones related to tools and weapons. But perfect dodges and perfect parries also give you a nice window of opportunity to move in with more attacks, and both Naoe and Yasuke can actually pull these off. It's just that some of them are better suited for one character or the other. On that note, I also want to talk about enemy difficulty. I gotta say that I was pleased to see enemies really keep you on your toes and their playstyles are diverse. I'd have to say that this is one of the most difficult AC games I played, if I were to say so in relative terms. Not like the most difficult game I played, but definitely the most difficult AC game. And I feel that part of that is because different enemies also have completely different play styles. So a samurai, for example, will be more deliberate, maybe slower, harder if not even impossible to assassinate, and oftentimes use unblockable attacks. Meanwhile, something like a shinobi, who's way more agile, feels very different to play against. So your reaction time here has to be much quicker, since they incorporate a lot of acrobatics and much faster movesets, and they can also take you by surprise as they also incorporate ninja tools in their arsenal. So it's not just melee attacks you have to worry from them, but they will also disengage and throw away kunais or even use smoke bombs, which is really awesome. Regular enemies, on the other hand, don't pose much of a problem, so you will still have the fodder that's just there to satisfy your bloodlust. However, samurai, ninjas, and ronin are foes you shouldn't take too lightly. On a similar note, I also want to say that in terms of new animations, it seems that there have been some significant improvements over here as well. I wouldn't say that completely flashed out quality, but I did notice many new animations for pretty much everything. So just to show you a few like really crazy examples, I noticed that NPCs can randomly stumble and fall down staircases. I've also noticed that different enemies react differently to your attacks. Like for example, these huge bulky dudes are able to even grab your weapons mid-attack, which is something that I haven't seen on anybody else. That and the general way more acrobatic movement style, especially of Naoe, that shows that there is really a lot of attention to detail on how she moves around. You can even use dodge preemptively to get down buildings more dynamically with this really awesome flair of sorts, so it feels like you're playing differently than before, but it still feels very much Assassin's Creed like. And I have to say that the Ubisoft jank is still there, so if you got used to that, the parkour and whatnot, it's obviously still going to be a Ubisoft game, but it makes the game feel both familiar and somewhat new at the same time. But like I said, we have to talk about the weapons, because the weapon selection is something that oftentimes I didn't particularly always enjoyed in previous Assassin's Creed games, but this has to be probably the only exception that I have made, because on both characters, almost all of their choices feel as satisfying as they feel distinct. However, I do have my favorites. So there's some drawbacks here because of that. You can only have two equipped at the same time, but you can swap between them with a D-pad, but each weapon type as well as the movement and the playstyle for it have their own skill trees. So Naoe will feature a katana, a kusarigama, tanto, plus some ninja tools including smoke bombs, shurikens, kunais and whatnot. Meanwhile, Yasuke features a long katana, a naginata, a kanabo, and a teppo, which is basically a musket sort of gun that replaces ninja tools. And after playing with each and every single one of them, I will have to say that Yasuke's naginata, the teppo, and Naoe's kusarigama definitely stand out the most to me. Not that the other options aren't great either, it's just that katana gameplay is something that I've already got majorly used to at this point. But the Naginata was definitely my favorite. This is what made Yasuke my favorite character to play with. The moveset on this weapon is great. It's highly impactful and it has this wicked slice and dice finisher that makes me wish YouTube had more lax demonetization rules. It's likely that this is going to see like limited ads in no time because of some of these finishers. And what's great about these random finishers is that there are multiple of them for each weapon, so that every time you pull them off, you're not always going to see the same one triggering. Sometimes it's this, but other times it could be a series of stabs or anything else in between. And one of the best abilities that I've unlocked for the Naginata is the Onslaught. This one costs 3 mastery points to unlock, which is basically your skill points, but it's highly worth it. This absolutely destroys even bosses with a series of stabs and slashes that are really easy to generate. Not gonna lie, like generating focus points is super easy in combat as long as you don't get damaged and deal damage yourself, so you can pretty much like almost spam them even against bosses. Meanwhile, Naoe's kusarigama also felt good. It's a whole different playstyle here that you have. Your heavy attack basically lets you spin the ball chain attached to the other part of the sickle, which is great if you want to do AoE sweeps versus multiple enemies. But this can also entangle your target, so it's especially useful against enemies with swords. Plus, if you entangle them, you can then pull them towards you or pull yourself towards them to follow up with other chains of attacks. The Tanto is also very interesting. This is pretty much a combination of a dagger plus your hidden blade, which comes with its own unique abilities. It's much faster paced, plus it can easily put enemies on their backs. This incorporates lots of stabs, like I said, but what I also liked was the Teppo that, again, Yasuke uses. So a ranged option, a form of a musket that takes quite a bit to charge, but it's highly precise and deals lots of damage, even against enemies that are armored otherwise. Now, since we talked about stealth, I'm glad to say that AC Shadows puts a huge emphasis on stealth gameplay, especially when you play as Naoe, and a big departure from how it was back in Valhalla. The highlight here is that stealth feels more realistic than ever, which means it's also not as easy to pull off at times, but there are tools to compensate for that. Like, notice how many of the enemy visions fluctuate when passing through light sources or when making sounds, even if technically nobody is around to see me. Well, that's part of the new Lights and Shadows engine. So just like in real life, if you make yourself easily visible, enemies won't take ages to detect you. In plain sight, it only takes for a glimpse for them to spot you if the meter is already almost filled, which kind of makes sense. What this means is that it emphasizes being more careful now when sneaking around, taking down light sources, and especially also making use of the new prone mechanic. The prone mechanic, in fact, isn't just a new feature for the sake of being new, it almost becomes mandatory in some of these situations. But it's easy to go prone using the same button. To crouch, you can just go prone by pressing it once again after crouching in the first place. Equally, Naoe's grappling hook also helps here a ton to more quickly jump and reach points directly above you, or just to go at the top of buildings. As long as you have a physical point to attach to, you can definitely pull this off, and that's because the grappling hook is fully physics based in all of its aspects. Quick mention here, I absolutely love the fact that you can grapple onto the ceiling of most of the rooms, because oftentimes you can maybe cause a ruckus or some noise and then just hang by the ceiling like a bat and wait for the next unsuspecting victim to pounce on. Like, really fun. Like I said, it feels like there's so many ways to toy with your food this time around. Obviously, like I said before, this mostly applies to Naoe and not to Yasuke. He's the more direct approach, meanwhile Naoe can be more dynamic because you can also use stealth much better. So Yasuke is much slower, which means it's going to be harder for him to hide, for example, or even climb structures. It's still like okay for him to hide because he can use vegetation and he also has the prone mechanic, but he's going to lack the same parkour skills, the agility, and obviously the grappling hook that Naoe has as an advantage. Now, during my time with the game, I didn't just have access to the prologue, but also a section of the open world, and specifically the same region we saw the initial gameplay reveal in, so the Harima region with the nearby town of Himeji. And this place looks just as good, if not even better, than in the trailer. So you have a pretty packed town with a huge castle on a cliff, then there's the place surrounding it, the river, and like pretty much tons of rice fields surrounding the entire area. Plus the vegetation here looking awesome with the cherry blossom trees, like pretty much all the temples, the bamboo forest, everything here. The highlight is that the game looks gorgeous, both in terms of the setting being Japan and the fact that this is completely next gen makes the game world look stunning. In terms of scenery and architecture, Ubisoft yet again doesn't disappoint, as their landmark recreation is one of the best. I can't say what happens beyond this region since we had invisible walls preventing us from leaving the demo area, but initial impressions are very strong on my part. Maybe the complaint I have here is that Yasuke, being so tall, sometimes feels odd and even out of place to maneuver around some of the smaller corridors, but that would literally be the case in real life as well with a tall person in these areas. I also don't know the extent of random events either, as I haven't seen too many. The only one I recall was some samurai going crazy on some rebels, and that was basically it. Now, in terms of things I found so and so, and maybe something that didn't completely blow me away, but something that I don't have many negatives to say either, one of them is the loot system, which pretty much makes a return. So it's like kind of stable AC at this point, color-coded, rarity-based gear with a handful of stats and some more or less stronger passives. You have 6 inventory slots here, 2 for the 2 weapons, 1 for the mount, 2 for the armor pieces, and a final one for amulets. So quite scaled down even compared to something like AC Valhalla. But in terms of how they behave, they appear quite similar to me. There are some unique skills on the gear sometimes, but that's mostly relegated to some of the higher end gear like legendaries and whatnot. Everything below it, from epic and below, seems rather dull and boring, just passive increases at that. So if you were okay with this system before, then you're going to continue to be okay with this. If not, it's still going to be a point of pain and maybe even become boring for you for a while, at least until you maybe reach the end game portion and get some of the better ones. I would say that expect gear to also drop from enemies. However, I've only seen a couple of them dropping from some of the enemies I defeated in my 4 hours of gameplay. At the same time, I will also say that some of the quests and missions provide extra loot drops as well. I also want to say that I kind of feel bad for the fact that even though each character has like 3 or 4 weapon selections, in reality you can only equip 2 of them, which feels unnecessarily limiting. I kinda get why they were aiming with this, like kinda give an option and make the choice more important, but at this point I think that just having that extra 3rd or 4th slot would have just made things better and given you the option to choose between any weapon at any given time. In terms of the story, I'm also kinda in between, but mostly because the preview was very contained and we haven't seen much in terms of character progression, plus we also skipped a bit from the time we played into the prologue. We went straight to a later on mission, so I didn't see much in terms of character progression. I did see the prologue, which also included how Yasuke was brought into Japan, and also the story did not shy away from mentioning he was brought in as a slave. But maybe some of the dialogues from early on felt a bit far-fetched, maybe a bit forced, just my opinion on it, in a way that it doesn't feel like he's being portrayed as a real person at times. But that is just to that prologue section. From that point on, it doesn't seem to suffer from the same issue. I think that the highlight here is that Ubisoft will likely be very tame and avoid taking major risks with the story. But what was positive here is that both the characters seem to have a strong sense of will and their motivation is deeply rooted into their past, and this helps make them more believable. At least that's from the brief story that I've seen. However, what I was surprised about is that there are indeed story choices and consequences, albeit what they seem to influence mostly is the secondary stuff. So I can't really say for sure if there are multiple possible endings to the story, since none of us have seen it yet, but there certainly were moments that got resolved differently depending on my dialogue options. So there were moments in the main story even when I had to decide if I should spare or take out a certain important character. Equally, on a smaller scale, how I approached a subject with various NPCs would lead to conflict or a peaceful resolution. For example, there was this one mission where I had to seek out help from a group of Ronin, but if I were to choose the antagonizing dialogue, they would obviously attack me. However, there was also a peaceful option in which they would just pass out the information quickly. However, in both of these scenarios, the remainder of the mission would continue exactly the same. So it was just that small section that was actually getting changed. And this is what I expect the rest of the decision making to be made, at least in terms of side content. Some extra options here and there that give you the appearance of choice, but mostly it's going to be quite a self-contained story that has a pretty clear linear path, at least until maybe some of the end decisions. That's at least my expectation for now. Now, in terms of how NPCs react, I know that a lot of you guys asked me about this in the preview post I made it, but it seems that it's not going to change much depending on which protagonist you play as. I did not notice NPCs reacting any differently to Yasuke than they would for Naoe. Unless, of course, you commit a crime or raise your weapon towards civilians, case in which you will see them fleeing in panic, but that's the case for both of the protagonists. Again, probably Ubisoft playing it safe, but it's quite in contrast with the fact that strangers do react to him during story moments and cutscenes. I don't see a problem in either way, so you're going to still have these moments, but don't expect like complete different reactions when playing in the open world. As for hindering or not his stealth mechanic, the only thing that will hinder Yasuke's stealth is Yasuke himself, the fact that his parkour is much slower and he climbs buildings and other structures much harder than Naoe does. Obviously, if you're going to want to go pure parkour and get all of those cool, flashy jump animations, you're going to want to go with Naoe. Yasuke is just not built to handle that. He's there more for the direct approach. However, he can still sneak around a little bit, like for example going in the shadows or going into tall grass. Obviously, he also has that prone mechanic just like Naoe does. It's just that he is much slower and also lacks the grappling hook from what I was able to tell. Other things that could maybe be improved and some of the negatives I've spotted in terms of the gameplay and other aspects. Obviously, the first is facial animations. Most of the NPCs, especially side characters that aren't relegated to the main story, just feel from a completely different and older game. Some of the face animations, even textures, look quite flat, didn't quite look up to the quality of the main characters. So obviously that's something not completely unexpected for budget and time-saving reasons. So don't go out there exploring and thinking that every single regular NPC will have the same level of quality as the main characters. Besides that, maybe the typical Ubisoft jank in some of the animations, even though there are many new animations. Maybe a personal pet peeve of mine, but sometimes I notice characters getting stuck in animations as you jump a tiny corner or a junction. It's something that I still notice to this day. It's like the game is trying to predict where you're going, but it's not always pulling it off successfully. However, you can kind of build around that, maybe avoid these spots or just dodge or jump in time, which is going to maybe fix it for you. Otherwise, mission structure, I haven't noticed anything that's completely new in terms of mission design, besides maybe the fact that you do have some choices here and there. So if you got bored maybe of the Ubisoft formula, and at this point the typical open world design formula, you're going to not see anything riveting over here either. Maybe with the exception of the main story, where some of the main characters can be offed. Besides that, small bugs, but I expect them to be fleshed out by the time the game comes out. To be honest, my experience with the game, at least bug-wise, was quite good. It definitely shows that the game has had these extra months of development. So far, I would say my outlook for Assassin's Creed Shadows is quite very positive, to be honest. I'm excited to play this game despite all the controversy. I'm excited to play more with Yasuke because I just enjoy the gameplay so much, and the open world just looks amazing. So yeah, that's pretty much my opinion for now. Obviously, there's going to be a bigger review once I get my hands on the full game, and will bring you like pretty much every single detail that I can. In the meantime, if you have any other questions that don't like belong in the spoiler category, I can try my best to answer them in future videos, as there's going to be more in terms of Assassin's Creed Shadows on the channel. So if you want to see more of that, make sure that you subscribe, activate the notification bell, and also leave a like on the video. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.